From the Cold Formed Steel Buildings Association, this is Cold Formed Buildings Made Easy with your hosts, John Koster and Lauren Toole.
Hello and welcome to Cold Formed Buildings Made Easy. I'm your host, John Koster, with my co-host, Lauren Toole. And today we are talking with one of the founding fathers of the Cold Formed Steel Building Association. He's been around the industry for a long time. He's been around metal for a good number of years and has some experience with setting up organizations similar to the one we're getting ready to launch ourselves. So, John Wilson, good to have you on the show. Welcome. And just give us a little bit of background as to where you've been in the metal industry and what led you to where you're at.
Well, I started 51 years ago. I went through the Ironworker Apprenticeship Program in St. Louis and started out erecting bridges, high rises, all kinds of steel structures. And in 1976, Kirby built the factory in Kuwait, pre-engineered metal building company. And from 78 to 85, I trained steel erectors in the Middle East, Africa, South America, Russia, all over. And when I came back from that little tour, we started a company. And that's when I really got involved in the self-storage industry. We built self-storage facilities in 46 states, like 600 facilities for everybody: Extra Space, U-Haul, Storage Mart, Store All, Store America, Store Everybody. That got me heavily involved in the storage industry. And at that time, the company was in Texas. So we were members of the Texas Storage Association. And I ended up on the board and ultimately became president for 1 year. And that really gave me an insight to how important these industry organizations are. I saw the self-storage evolve from the mini warehouse industry to the self-storage industry. And just, it's kind of an interesting thing. The reason they changed the name was because when we called them mini warehouses, when we went to the city to get a permit, they wanted us to have 2 parking spaces for every tenant and all kinds of other requirements that the industry doesn't need. And they wanted firewalls between every unit. Imagine that these self-storage facilities have 1,000 rooms. So that would be 1,000 fire doors, 1,000 firewalls. It basically would make the business not work, not pencil out. I watched the industries, the Self-Storage Association, the Texas Storage Association, hired lobbyists, and we did a lot of work to get the codes changed. And just for example, in Florida, the code went from wanting 2 parking spaces per tenant to wanting 2 parking spaces for the facility and then 1 for every 100 units. So the parking spaces went from 2,000 parking spaces to 12. That's just a small example. And there's really hundreds of examples like that the storage industry did for the storage customers once they had an association. I also, 50 years I've been watching the MBMA, and they also got a lot of codes changed, a lot of things changed to make the metal building industry more competitive, because in the beginning, you only had Class A structural steel codes, and they wanted the metal buildings to comply to those codes. And of course, that made them cost a whole lot more than they cost today. And there's a huge value in everyone in the industry forming these associations and doing the things that you need to do to educate the politicians and educate the fire marshals and the city officials to why, we want to change some things. And another one was traffic counts. They thought that the storage industry would cause a big influx of traffic, and they wanted to charge a lot of impact fees in some places. Well, the reality is the storage industry, the average tenant, we know after doing studies, we know visits once a month, and it doesn't cause a huge amount of traffic. So those are the kind of things that were used to change the industry, to make things more competitive, more user-friendly to that specific industry. And this is a new industry, and we need to do the same thing. We don't need to comply with some of the codes for the bigger industrial buildings, and that would make our product more competitive, less expensive, and more useful to our customers.
I was just curious, how did you get started?
I started in the cold form industry before it came to the United States. The cold form industry in Australia is a $3 billion industry, and the economy of Australia is about $1.5 trillion, which is about the size of Florida. So we still haven't hit 100 million in this country. An economy the size of Florida, it's a $3 billion industry in that country. So in about 2015, 14, myself and another colleague of mine that I've worked with over the years, who was in Australia, started working on getting the codes changed in Dubai to get the cold form industry in this country. And they thought it would be easy. They thought it would be easy to change the codes from the Australian codes to this code. They thought it would take 3 months. And 3 years later, the first guy dropped out. We did a lot of studying at the time, we did a lot of comparison of the weights of the buildings to the MBS buildings that everybody software that everybody uses here. And we just found that it could be very competitive and that the light gauge buildings probably would compete with about 25 to 35% of the MBMA market, which that's a huge amount of work that we're barely scratching the surface of. So I've been excited about Coldform for a long time. And then when I came back, I was working overseas during COVID, and COVID drove me back to the United States. And that's how I got hooked up with Quicken. My daughter, actually, I was complaining about not being able to find a job during COVID. And my daughter just grabbed my phone, said, "Give me your phone," and went to LinkedIn. And in 1 minute, she found Jonathan Sherrill, the guy who owned Quicken. And when I read about what he was doing, I thought, shoot, he doesn't even know what he has. I'm going to call him. And I basically called him and hired myself. Told him I could help him grow his company. And it grew 3 times the next year. He had the foresight to buy the big equipment and get the right equipment to go after the industry, but he didn't know the industry like I did. So it was a good marriage for a few years.
It seems to be a trend with a lot of manufacturers. They had it, and it was just kind of an afterthought for a long time. But as more of them are coming on board, and part of it's the competition and knowing that everybody else has got it, but people are starting to really realize the full potential of these buildings and what they're capable of doing.
I was with the self-storage business before it was an industry. Now it's bigger than the sports industry and the movie industry combined. And you're going to see the same thing with this industry evolving in the next 20 or 30 years. I think we're in the right place at the right time. I'm sitting here at Allied, and we have a facility here that's 1,000 foot long, has the most robotized, computerized steel fabrication facility on earth. And if you wanted a 50 by 100, you couldn't have it for 10 weeks. Whereas with the Coldform building, I could actually deliver it next week, 2 or 3 weeks for sure. So that's something they'll never be able to compete with. So it's a big advantage on the smaller building, the buildings that fit the parameters of the Coldform buildings.
What would the process be for, we're talking about getting codes changed and everything. What's the process like, and how long does it take to get the codes changed?
Well, it takes a while. But, it takes putting a team of people together. You're going to have engineers to make your point. And then, we had lobbyists. We hired lobbyists that just worked for the TMSA had its own lobbyists, and the self-storage has its own lobbyists. But, we got a lot of things done over the years. Like I said, changing codes and changing, for a while, the government wanted to put them on military bases, which meant that it would be, there's a lot of self-storage facilities right outside of a military base. And that's how they make their living. And for a while, the government was talking about putting their own mini self-storage facilities on military bases. And we got that stopped. Those are just an example of the things that I saw happen over the years. Yeah, but it just takes an effort. You have to put a team of people together, and you have to appeal to the governing bodies. And you have to make a good point over why, things should be this way. Hopefully people listen to reason and you can make changes.
What is your main goal with this association?
Well, I can tell you I had 3 goals when I was the president of the Texas Storage Association. One of them was to grow the business. We did that by training managers. If you create more work, it's better for everybody, right? So if you create more work, the vendors are happier. Everybody involved is happier. So the idea is to educate people. One of the things we did is put in education programs to teach the managers how to sell, how to fill their self-storage facilities. Education and enlightenment, educating people on what we do. And then, of course, any kind of best practices and training is always helpful to everybody. We had to do a lot of things. I'm using the self-storages because I know it. But we actually paid to have the traffic counts done for 30 days. So we could go to them and prove to them that they don't get that many visits. The same with the fire marshal. The fire marshals hated self-storage in the beginning. I remember being in one town council meeting, and the fire marshal wanted a key to every facility, every unit in the self-storage. That's ridiculous. But that's what that one individual wanted. Those are the kind of things you got to squash. It's silliness. You're dealing with tens of thousands of individual cities in this country. So far, what the program that we're all using has really done a good job of getting through the city. The documents that the ACT program puts out, I haven't had one city reject them yet. Even the concrete design, which is very simple and much better than anything that the metal building companies come up with.
Yeah, I'm going through the process right now with a local nonprofit. We're working on getting a building approved. And the thing that strikes me is, how simple the engineering can be, how simple the design process can be, how easy things are from that standpoint. but just the amount of red tape and the amount of, I had to go to a variance hearing with them. They got that approved. They had to go to the state, have an architect sign off on it. Had to go back to the engineer and get a few things and stuff. So there's a lot of roadblocks that an organization like the Cold Form Steel Building Association can help to kind of remove some of those and kind of help grease those wheels a little bit.
And again, a lot of it is simple education, and people have a lot of beliefs that just simply aren't true.
What are some of the biggest roadblocks that you are seeing for cold form builders right now?
The biggest roadblock is people's perception of it. When you say it's light gauge, they have this silly thing that it's like cheaper, but again, this is an education project. They meet the same code. So that it's actually a silly question when they meet the same code. The code is what spells the loads and what it has to stand up to. It doesn't really matter whether it's made out of popsicle sticks or steel or hay if it meets the code. And two is, you really have to train the erectors. If you just turn it over to standard metal building erectors, they automatically don't like it and they badmouth it. So you really have to if they're going to use a classic metal building erector, you really have to talk to him first and educate him first before he shows up with a crane and all kinds of stuff he doesn't need and wastes a lot of money and then badmouths the building to his customer, which is our customer.
When you get a customer, how do you make sure they have the right erector?
Well, at Quicken, we had a few that we recommended. We when we sell the job, I'm sure you guys do the same. We send them all this. There's a lot of great sales aids. There's a lot of great videos. If people will do them, the biggest problem we always had was with the metal building erectors. The people that did the best job were really the husband and wife that put it up themselves. They'd call me on the phone, and the husband would be doing the work, and the wife would be reading the drawings. They actually did a better job than some of the metal building erectors. Everything is a discipline. Everything is training, and everything is reading the directions and following the rules that the people that have been doing this a long time wrote to make it work.
What about those guys who builds like red irons and think they can just knock this out like a red iron?
Well, that's what I'm talking about. Those are the guys I'm talking about. They're the worst guys. When I know they're a metal building dealer, a red iron guy, I call them personally. And I tell them, I said, if you will listen to me, I can make this easy. If you don't listen to me, you're going to call and complain because it's a different process. And the funny thing is, half of it's the exact same. When you get to the sheeting and the trim is the exact same. It's the exact same pieces. The same detail. So the only difference is the framing. So it's really just a small part of the process, but it is different.
Yeah, I think that same principle applies, all the way up and down the chain with learning how to build the buildings, learning how to manufacture, how to treat these buildings as they're going through the manufacturing plant and getting shipped out the door. A lot of the folks that manufacture these buildings, they're component manufacturers, and as you said earlier, component manufacturing and selling is completely different than selling a building. And it's the willingness to be taught, it's the willingness to learn, and it's just if you're not willing to stop and learn, you're going to get left behind in a lot of things, and we see that happen all the time. And it hasn't. Again, we haven't quite started to hit that curve and that escalation with cold form, but it's coming.
And the biggest thing is, I don't like to use the word obstacle because I don't really believe in it. But the biggest thing is that it gives the industry a bad name when these people have problems that they shouldn't have, or the building falls down when it shouldn't, or they damage pieces because they don't keep track of them. And so that's really what I see the biggest challenges. Again, it's just all really education.
And it's about getting out on those job sites and taking a look. In my previous work, I had to go visit a job site where somebody said, I'm missing pieces and I don't have pieces here. And I was on site 30 seconds and was able to go, here they are. And that's educating people what to look for and getting ahead of those things before they start to spread word and the misinformation.
I'll tell you the best one. So we get a phone call, and it was actually this company because the Allied was a dealer of Quicken. And the customer says, we didn't ship the ridge caps. Well, of course, we have pictures of the trucks, and we know we shipped the ridge caps. And so the lady for Allied, the customer service says, would you please send me some pictures of the job site? They send pictures of the job site. Come to find out that it had rained and the job site was all muddy, and they were using the ridge caps to step from foundation to foundation. They were scattered all over the job. like pavers, So that's what you're dealing with.
Right, exactly.
And I think they're just going to call in, and again, you have to learn how to manage that process with telling them that without completely making them look stupid, But the reality is, it's pretty stupid. It's easy to call and say, "Oh, I don't have this. You didn't send it." Well, we've all gotten pretty smart. I know, I've been taking pictures of trucks for for 40 years. So it's been going on a long time. And we get more specific now, make sure we take pictures of the labels. We know what left our place.
And so the manufacturers are smart with that, and they take all the photographs. They know exactly what was on that truck. They've got the photo and video evidence, and you go all the way up the chain with cold form buildings. The engineers got it, every I dotted, every T crossed, and
right.
In the software they can track every single change that was made to that building, and can track back to, okay, this is where this changed, this is where that changed, and not to say that mistakes don't happen, but the track record is pretty solid, for cold form steel buildings. And every time something comes up, a building went over, well, what happened? It's always the bracing strap. There's no bracing on that building.
Always.
With the cold industry booming, how can you know if you're dealing with a good dealer or somebody who doesn't know what they're talking about?
Well, it's easy for me. I can talk to them, but if you're a novice, you really just have to go with track records. I worked with a behavior coach for a while. He was a PhD in organizational behavior, and he had a great saying. He said, "The best predictor of future behavior is past behavior." And I was just dealing with a messed up standing seam roof. And I'm a roofing consultant. And, I've learned over the years that the guy that screwed up the roof can't possibly fix it, because if he knew what he was doing, he wouldn't have screwed it up. I've never put down a bad roof. I don't leave a bad roof. So the idea that the guy that messed it up is going to go back and patch it up, that's not going to happen. So you have to find the people that have a history of success, just like a surgeon, just like anything else. It's just in our industry, you don't have to be certified. You don't have to have a degree. You don't have to do these things. So it's your job. I mean, I had a back surgery. I went to 5 surgeons before I found one to cut on my back. I'm the only one that I know that had surgery 40 years ago that walked away. Everybody else was crippled. But I spent a whole lot of time finding a guy that had a success rate. And unfortunately, people tend to believe people that advertise, and people tend to believe things that aren't true. In the bar, everybody's a hero. Everybody's the best. Everybody can hit a golf ball 300 yards in the bar. Certifying erectors is always been an issue. The erector happens to bring all the value, and the building's not worth anything on the truck. It's worth scrap steel. If you leave it on the truck, it ends up worth in scrap steel. The guy that brings the value in the end is the erector. So we really do have to take the time to ensure that there's qualified erectors out there, and we help them all we can and give them the training they need to learn the differences between our structure and whatever else they've been doing.
That's definitely been one of the challenges is finding the erectors and finding the ones that are properly trained. But certainly one of the goals of the association is to connect people to those who are willing to come alongside people to train them upright. And ultimately, the certification may ultimately be a part of that as well.
Butler had a great training program. And if you became a Butler dealer, you had to go to Kansas City and go to school, no matter who you were. I mean, they made me go to school, and I used to teach the school for Kirby. They didn't care. Everybody went to school for 3 days, where they spent 1 day telling you about the products and 2 days walking you through all of the details and all the important things and talking to the engineers and the things you needed to know to be, what I would call a professional erector, not a guy playing games, building a fort.
John, real quick, just give your elevator pitch. If somebody's, I've been hearing about cold form and this and that, why should I get involved in the Cold Form Steel Building Association? Why is that going to benefit?
Well, I've been saying all along, I think the benefit to joining the association is being with a bunch of like-minded people, learning the best practices, and having a resource to go to if you do have a problem.
Very true. Yeah. We're excited about the Cold Form Association. We're happy to have you involved in that. Excited to see what growth this industry is going to have. The time has come, and we've got a lot of work ahead of us to get some codes changed and to change people's perception, and primarily just to grow awareness of what cold formed is, so people aren't having to stop and say, well, what's a cold formed building? But if you're driving through Australia, you're not going to see a post frame building. You're going to see cold framed everywhere.
Well, they don't even have a PEB business. They have hot rolled steel and they have cold form. And my friend actually went there for Blue Scope to sell the PEB buildings, and he couldn't sell them because they don't want them. They want cold form.
Yeah.
And if it's bigger than cold form, they want hot rolled steel. There is no PEB building. We have the opposite issue here. We're trying to infiltrate their market, but the difference is this is faster and it should be lighter once we get some things worked out, but it's definitely faster.
Definitely faster, and a lot of cost savings in that lighter material with the equipment that you have to have, and also with the foundation.
And with the foundation, and that's a big thing we need to educate people on, and we actually need to spend the money and have one of each engineered and be able to tell them how many yards of concrete and how much rebar and how much man hours are going to save. That's something very measurable. But to do that, you gotta get the same soils conditions and get an engineer to do both, and then do a takeoff and do it. But that's not hard to do. But someone has to do it.
When you've got a professional association, those are the kind of things you can do to
Exactly.
to show people.
And I can promise you it's a couple $1,000s, and that could very well be the difference in the price of the building.
John Wilson, thank you so much for joining us on the on Cold Form Buildings Made Easy. We appreciate your knowledge. We appreciate your experience, and looking forward to watching the Cold Form Building Association come to life over the next year and seeing where it goes.
Myself, thank you guys.
I'm John Cosper. This is Lauren Toole. You've been listening to Cold Form Buildings Made Easy. Thank you for joining us.